Good morning and welcome everybody here. This is day 2 of the Tech and Society Conference. As many of you know, we are pioneering and trying to innovate on a new format, which is a hybrid format, both in person and remote. We think that hopefully will open up attendance further to people that aren't even in the area locally, plus have a good quality discussion here. As you know, with the goals of the conference, we're trying to really highlight where can technology be used for good. And we're trying to think about, with all of that, what are the tech-lash issues? Data privacy issues, antitrust issues, future of work issues, and how do you navigate the balance between the two of those issues? We had a great kickoff yesterday with Juan Enriquez, and hopefully most of you were there. A lot of interesting thoughts about life sciences, about the Genome Project, and then getting into a much broader discussion about technology and society, and how do you kind of create better opportunities. Some good kind of reminders from him about how to think about problems, and be really thoughtful about collecting the context, the information before moving ahead. Today's conference, we're going to have 3 topics. So AI for Good is going to be the first topic, which couldn't be, again, a more timely one with the explosion of data and the ability to analyze it. Second topic is going to be global innovation, so innovations from around the world. And a reminder there, a lot of leapfrog innovation is happening outside the US. And that's why looking at business models, products, services, et cetera, outside the US matters so much. And then a third topic is going to be green tech. And green tech, how can you use technology to help in one of the biggest areas of concern in society today, climate change, sustainability, et cetera. If I were to give you advice or make a request as you listen to today's sessions, 2 things I'd ask. One is to get in the ring on the issues. And what I mean by that is hear people out in what they have to say on all sides, thinking about what technology really can do in areas like healthcare and transportation, et cetera, and then think about what are some of the challenges there. It's very easy to get absolutist on positions, to get extreme on one side or the other, which starts to kind of create a question about, do you really have all of the facts there? And then the second issue as a request is put yourself in the role of a leader. You know, this is one of the defining things about being at a business school and focusing on leadership. Leaders have to take decisions, they have to get a group of people together, and they have to go execute against things. So just understanding an issue and taking a position on an issue isn't enough. It's one of the necessary parts, but it's not all of leadership. So think about what the leadership imperative would be as you listen to these things. And I always find there's kind of 2 questions that define leadership. What would you do? So not what's your point of view, but what would you actually go do if you're in the position of a leader? And what does success look like? What are you ultimately trying to achieve? And I find those are reconciling questions to a lot of the kind of disparate views that exist. So first session that's going to be up is AI for Good. And we couldn't have a better moderator than Heather Caruso. Heather is our Assistant Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Her research, she's a faculty member here. She's an adjunct assistant professor in the management and organizations area. Her research is focused very much on collaboration, on team dynamics, and on leadership. One of the frameworks that she has brought to the school that I think is super helpful, matter of fact, I use in my class, is the ECHO framework that really gets people to think about, are you really taking on information? Are you reflective about it? Are you humble in how you execute on things, et cetera? So it's been a huge help. She's got a great academic background on top of everything, Stanford undergrad and PhD at Harvard. So Heather, let me turn it over to you and welcome.
Thank you so much. Hi, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be with you, and I really want to thank you for attending this session of the Tech and Society Conference. I also want to take a moment to thank Terry Kramer and the whole Easton Center team for giving us this space to have an open and a courageous conversation about these issues, and in particular, about how we go about aligning tech-based innovation with the ultimate well-being of our society, and how we might sometimes get pulled off track. It will come as no surprise to many in our audience that these are particularly hot, particularly focal issues in the domain of artificial intelligence, which many refer to as AI. I think it's important to recognize that we are in a difficult position as everyday users and consumers of AI. It's often easier to kind of start to use it, start to rely on it, just become kind of enmeshed in the world that is created by it without really understanding a lot of the details about how it works, which puts everyday users in a difficult position when it comes to informed decision-making about how well AI is actually aligning with their individual goals and with underlying sort of societal goals. So when we're sort of browsing the web and getting product recommendations, or when we're trying to buy a ticket from virtual customer service agents, when we're getting driving directions or fully automated driving assistance from our cars, it's difficult to know whether or not the reference information and the reasoning that's being used to guide us is actually aligned with our preferences, with our underlying individual and societal objectives. And so that can be a challenge. It also sort of adds to the difficulty that in contrast to situations where we're dealing with guidance from real-world human beings, with AI systems, we often cannot just turn to the system and tell us, ask it to tell us where it's coming from and kind of why it's doing what it's doing, and that kind of adds to some of the mystique. So it means that producers of AI have to do a lot to sort of earn trust and to build confidence among consumers. They have to uphold the responsibility to do good with the technology, while making sure that they're still pushing the boundaries and they're still exploring and doing the work of innovation, which is fundamentally unpredictable. You're going to be developing these technologies where the capabilities and the impacts can never be fully sort of mapped out in advance. And we know that the firms that are doing this are going to be up against sort of a little bit of skepticism, right? So we know, according to 2020 Financial Times data, that it's about a third of consumers only these days who are comfortable interacting with businesses that interact with them through AI. We know that fully 53% of consumers feel that AI systems will always be sort of making decisions and providing guidance bearing the biases of their original creators. We know that only about 12% of consumers in those data feel that AI systems can reliably distinguish good from evil. Right? And so when those are the sorts of feelings that your consumers have, to be a producer, to be a developer of AI, I think is an enormous challenge and an enormous responsibility. Although it's also notable that there's quite a lot of enthusiasm for AI. We know that just if you look at everyday consumer behavior, we clearly enjoy the fruits of all of this technology. We are, using the recommendation engines for everything from, where to eat, what restaurants to go to sort of what romantic partners to try out. We're definitely enjoying the efficiencies that we're getting from AI-driven search and navigation. We're certainly appreciating the efficiency and the effectiveness of AI-driven healthcare systems and all of that. So I think the imperative for leaders, for firms in this space, is to try to figure out how to kind of maximize and sustain the advantages of artificial intelligence while making sure to identify and minimize any of the aspects of the systems that can do us harm. Okay, so that's going to be the sort of context in which we set this conversation. And to help us reflect on these important issues and considerations, I could not be more delighted than to have our special guest for today, Dr. John Kelly III, who is a renowned leader in the tech space, a driver of innovation in almost any area you can think of when it comes to information technology, recently retired as Executive Vice President of Cognitive Solutions and IBM Research after over 4 decades of leadership there. Perhaps most widely known as the father of Watson, the famed AI-driven, I think, 2-time Jeopardy champion that IBM produced. Dr. Kelly actually put IBM at the forefront of innovation in everything from semiconductors to supercomputers to many other technologies. He has actually done so well for IBM that they have been able to maintain their status as a U.S. patent leader for the last 28 years running straight. You can also see his impact in terms of driving transformative collaborations, and these ones can span the globe. So he created a network of IBM labs that engaged 3,000 scientists and technical workers across, I believe, 12 labs and 10 countries. And more recently, in a really uniquely boundary-spanning collaboration, brought IBM together with Microsoft and the Roman Catholic Church to become initial signatories to the ROM Call for AI Ethics. Unsurprisingly, Dr. Kelly has received numerous honors and awards, including 3 honorary doctorates to join his initial PhD in mechanical engineering from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. He also won that institution's Lifetime Achievement Award. He's also gotten the National Academy of Engineering's Arthur M. Bush Award for driving excellence through corporate, government, and university collaboration. He's an excellent guest to bring to help us think through these issues. I want to welcome him. John, thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Heather. Great to be with you all.
Thank you. I want to get started, John, by thinking about your position seeing multiple transformative technologies rise and become mature over the course of your career. And in the context of that experience, I want to know if you think about the ethical conversation that's happening now with artificial intelligence as distinct from the ethical conversations that typically arise and have arisen with those new technologies, or is there something meaningfully different about what you're hearing today?
Sure. Well, Heather, first, my thanks to you and the whole team at UCLA and Chris Lowe, who was very helpful in reaching out and bringing me in. So thank you all for this opportunity. As you'll see, this is a topic that I'm very, very passionate about. So to your question, there's many similarities with the ethical implications of AI to what I've seen in other technologies, but there's a big difference. So when you think back, all new technologies raised ethical questions going back to the steam engine, atomic energy, the internet, all of those, which were technologies that were advancing at sort of exponential rates, caused people to really pause and think about, well, what are the good and the bad uses of this technology? What are the ethical implications? What I think is different about AI is that it so much gets at who we are as humans, because it's coexisting, augmenting our cognitive capabilities. And whenever you're doing that, I think we're into a different level of ethical issues. And it sort of relates to who we are as humans. And, I'll never forget a couple of conversations or a couple of conversations and instances, when you reference Watson winning in Jeopardy, and of course it beat 2 champions, but Ken Jennings was the all-time winner. And I later saw Ken on a TED Talk where he said in front of an audience, when I lost that match, I've gone through a process where I really don't know who I am, because that game and my championship was who I am. And now a computer took that. Another conversation I found very interesting was with Gary Kasparov. Before we did Watson, Heather, we built a machine 10, 15 years before that, which became the grand master of chess and beat Gary Kasparov. Years and years later, I had lunch with Gary and a couple of other people, and he was obviously very upset when a machine called Deep Blue at the time beat him. But someone at the lunch asked him, said, "Gary, would you rather have been beaten by a machine or a person?" And he paused, and then he got very animated, and he said, "No, you don't understand. It doesn't matter if it was a machine or a person. I never lost a chess match. I never lost, and now I lost." So those two things just strike me that with AI, we're getting so close to who we are as humans and how we identify ourselves that I think it raises it to a whole new level of ethical requirements, Heather.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. And it drives at something that I think is probably part of every innovative push and effort, but maybe has particular significance in this domain, which is, when you're driving that innovation, you have to balance two imperatives. You have to balance the imperative to disrupt and to sort of teach everybody what we didn't know before, to surprise everyone, to see what role these technologies can play in our lives, recognizing we can't always foretell that. That's the one imperative on that side, but then there's the imperative, obviously, to do no harm. And when we're talking about technologies that get so close to who we are as human beings, understanding the various kinds of harm that people can feel, the visible and the invisible, the internal, the emotional harm, those kinds of things get to be quite complex. So I wonder if you could reflect over the course of your career on how you have balanced those two different imperatives and how you would recommend that leaders in general in this space think about balancing those two.
Sure, sure. It's there's it's the old, there's a ditch on both sides of the road. You can almost become paralyzed and say, well, I shouldn't innovate, I shouldn't invent this because someone might take it and do something wrong with it. On the flip side, and this is always how I've thought about it, if it can be done, it will be done by someone. And I think it's incumbent upon us then to have the most ethical leaders, the most ethical people doing it, and to recognize the ethical implications and have open discussions and set a set of principles in terms of how to guide one's decisions in this area. And I will probably talk more about how you set those principles and how you think about them. But think about a technology like AI. It's advancing so fast, just in its raw capability. You mentioned lots of the applications. It is everywhere, and it gets smarter every time it's used, and it never forgets. So it's not like when you have a technology like that, it's not like you can sit down and write, 5 rules and it covers every case of AI. So what I have always found the best way is to drop back to whatever set of principles that we can use in guiding every decision we make every day in both inventing the technology and using the technology.
It's a really interesting point that these principles can be used as a sort of beacon towards which we aim when we're developing the technologies. I want to ask you, in some sense, to think about where those principles come from. So, as you know, the EU recently unveiled a draft set of regulations, sort of top-down principles in a sense, aimed at regulating commercial and governmental use of artificial intelligence across a variety of applications, from self-driving cars to hiring processes, and banning some things altogether, like automatic facial recognition in public spaces. Do you think of that sort of regulation as effective or feasible in terms of really being the driver of ethics in AI?
Well, here's how we approached it at IBM. In the early days of Watson and AI, we could see clearly the ethical implications of the technology. And in IBM, we have sort of a history of not only do we invent it, but you mentioned all the patents, but we also believe it's part of our job to introduce it ethically. And so I'm actually sitting today in the conference room in IBM Research, the Watson Research Center, where I first saw Watson in action, and sitting in this chair. And I remember a chill went up my spine, Heather, and I said, oh my God, this is going to change the world. This is going to change the world. And that was about a year and a half or so before the rest of the world saw Watson. So I started to think about, and leaders in IBM started thinking, well, how are we going to deal with this? And so we decided to go principles based. And by principles, I mean, for instance, just a few of the ones we derived, which is it takes data to train these AI engines, these AI computers. And the first principle we set was your data is your data, and we have no right to take it, use it without your permission, or resell it, because your data is now part of who you are. So your data is your data. Second kind of a principle became, if we use AI in a product, we'll tell you that we're using it. So it's not some hidden thing in the background that you're not aware of. We'll tell you if and when we're using it. And a third example would be, since AI is a machine that's trained by humans and data, another principle we established is we'll tell you who trained our AI machine. So for instance, if it's in healthcare, we'll tell you that Memorial Sloan Kettering doctors trained it and not someplace else. So a lot of these are around transparency. So as we advanced those principles, though, it became obvious to us a few years ago that they were wonderful and they were helping the 400,000 IBM employees and developers of applications think it through. But we came to realize that we also needed regulation, but we were very specific. We needed precision regulation. So because each use case of AI is dramatically different, and it's very hard to just blanket regulate. So we became very vocal proponents of precision regulation around specific uses of facial recognition or voice recognition or other kinds of AI. So we believe that the best balance is principles-based and then very precise regulation versus blanket regulation, which might actually harm the advance of the technology.
It's a wonderful way to strike the balance and to make sure that you're incorporating sort of individual dignity and some recognition of the importance of external stakeholders being part of the conversation. And that brings me to a question about where you think the principles for any given leader within a firm should come from. Whose principles do they use? If you're the EVP or if you're a developer on the ground, whose principles are you referencing, and how do you ensure that those principles are interpreted consistently throughout your organization? So it's not like you have different sets of principles being used by the different people who touch the technology.
Yeah, well, in the end, Heather, the principles, I think, are based on an individual or a group or a company's sort of moral values. That's the sort of the fundamental base. And so you always want people that set the principles, to be the most ethical and moral, particularly when you're dealing with these bleeding edge technologies that are going to change the world and are changing the world. I will admit, though, it gets complex because, as soon as you start to talk about morals, you're also into cultures, and different cultures have different moral standards and values. So in a company like IBM, we're in literally every country in the world, in large numbers. And so we really think carefully, will this principle translate across cultures? But we also believe that while, we might be different in the US versus, Europe versus China versus India, the company of IBM has a constant moral standard that the company is built on. And so we try to make those principles and values so bedrock that they do translate across. And then we as a group of leaders, get together. We had, I can't tell you how many rounds of discussions on those principles. And, we reached a conclusion on them. And, I will admit some wanted to become very specific, but I reminded them that, we're in the early innings here of AI. And so they have to be durable. and last over time, because you never want to put out a principle and have to reel it back in later.
Right.
So it's dynamic, but it's really bedrock.
Yeah. I like that notion of, any individual leader needing to think about the extent to which the principles that they're using really reflect the principles of the organization, and to be in conversation with the rest of the organization to make sure that they are in fact in touch with that, and that the articulation of those values and those morals is flexible enough to go across the different cultures, to be understood well across the different cultures, while still being bedrock and still being firm. And that makes me just want to check in on an implication of this. To your point, when you're talking about morals and ethics, it's very difficult to say, okay, we said we were committed to this today, and then like next year, not so much. But to the earlier part of our conversation about always being at the forefront, always kind of pushing into a space that can't be completely predicted, how do you think about finding out that you were wrong about something as an individual developer, as a firm? What's the process for learning from experience and updating perhaps the way in which we serve our ethical principles?
Yeah. So, while it's bedrock for us, we also learn as the technology develops. And because we do so much very advanced research, our high beam headlights into where the technology is going to go for at least the next decade or two is usually pretty good. And that allows us to establish principles that are enduring. That said, we do learn from it. And, as an example, the topic of, facial recognition, as you mentioned, as more and more data became available on biases that were being developed in those AI machines, we went into high gear. We really we changed our AI engines to remove as much of the bias as we possibly could. And then ultimately we said that, look, we're not going to continue to sell products based on facial recognition, because as good as our principles are, it's almost impossible to completely remove bias. Because remember, the machine learns based on the data, and whatever sample data you give it is what it learns. Not unlike humans, by the way. That's how we learn. And so we just realized that in that particular situation, the risk reward for society wasn't worth it, and we changed.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great story. I think it's not told enough. The way in which learning experiences in this space can sometimes teach you that you don't want to go any further in this domain,
right.
That you actually want to pivot and focus elsewhere. So thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to give our audience a chance to hear a little bit about one of the more recent and really sort of extraordinary collaborations that you have put together to help further drive innovation and to center ethics in the development of artificial intelligence. I'm talking here about the ROM Call for AI ethics and the way you brought IBM and Microsoft together with the Roman Catholic Church to become the initial signatories of that document. Can you tell us a little bit about what it is and your involvement in it, and what led you to think that IBM should become one of these initial signatories?
Sure. So it's sort of an amazing story. So I'll keep it brief. But as we were wrestling with, all of the moral, ethical implications of AI just a few years ago, amazingly, the Pope was thinking about the same thing. And so he turned to his Pontifical Academy, which is, think of it as the Pope's think tank, and asked them to really think about and study the implications of artificial intelligence. He, as I understand, did not quite understand it, but he understood the potential. And interestingly enough, he was interested in making sure that it was used ethically, but available globally because he saw it as a tremendous tool to advance humanity, but it could also be another have and have not in the world. And he was very concerned about a new sort of AI divide emerging. So he charged his Pontifical Academy. They came in to the United States and visited ourselves for a couple of days, as well as Microsoft. And through those discussions, we realized that we were tackling and thinking about the same challenges and problems through different lenses, but ultimately we were worried about exactly the same things. And so we and Microsoft were invited to work with the Pontifical Academy to develop a set of principles that the Catholic Church could also endorse. And that then became the ROM Call in and around AI ethics, which myself and Brad Smith from Microsoft went to Rome and signed just before COVID completely broke out, by the way, and put us all back on the ground. But it was an amazing effort. And it's, who would have believed that IBM, Microsoft, much less the Catholic Church, would come together and work on something. But I think that in itself tells you how important this topic is.
It's a really extraordinary step forward. And it's funny, I think it was Microsoft's Brad Smith that said that people might think of IBM, Microsoft, and the Roman Catholic Church as sort of strange bedfellows in an endeavor like this together. And that just sort of makes me wonder what you think of the process of that and how, on such a complex and multifaceted issue, three such, powerful and independent entities with very strong sorts of principles of their own walking into that space. How do you collaborate on something like this? How do you come in the end to a document that you can all agree on, coming from different perspectives, especially with IBM and Microsoft and some spaces being competitive? I mean, how do you balance all of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll tell you what we did and how it worked, and it's a process that I've used in other international sort of partnerships. We didn't, in the first couple of days of meetings, we didn't sit down and try to write the rules or the principles. We didn't, well, here's 20 rules, let's vote on 10, and that's what we'll sign. We started with an understanding of each other's values and morals, I guess. And, as an example, the Pontifical Academy was as interested in learning about how IBM thinks about the future of computing, like quantum computing, and what is that going to mean to society, as they were artificial intelligence. So we went off into these other, dimensions and issues, and we took them in different areas. And what we did is we basically established a trust that we were all seeking the same thing. We all had the same fundamental value system, and therefore it is possible that we could agree on a set of principles. And that's exactly what happened. So after that couple of days together, we all realized that we're pretty much cut from the same cloth from a value standpoint and ethics standpoint. And then our teams could get to work on what specifically were the principles going to be in the ROM Call. So we didn't gun jump, to try to get to an answer, which is, in tech and for type A's, we generally try to do that. It was a setback, and as humans, let's make sure we're on the same page before we get started.
I appreciate your underscoring that. I think that's something that we try actually to bring into a lot of our classrooms, because we do have a lot of type A personalities, a lot of students who want to jump in and solve problems, and there's a tendency when coming into a room with other people to start by figuring out, well, what do you want to do? And what do I want to do? And you jump right into some kind of a negotiation of your positions on the issue. And what you're describing sounds like a really different and also just a richer and a more robust way to build an actual relationship with people, which is first to just find out what motivates you, what gets you into the room, to begin with, what do you care about in the broader scheme of things. And then once you understand the extent to which you are aligned on those broader principles, you can come together to talk about specific things that you might collaborate on together.
Yeah, I think if we had tried to just jump to the answer, we would have gone to the whiteboard and said, well, here's a list of good uses and bad uses. Do we all agree? For instance, we would have completely missed the Pope's concern of equity of use. And we had a long discussion about that. He was very concerned that areas in South America would get access to it, the poor would get access to it, that particularly when it reached applications like healthcare or education, it would reach the young as well as the elderly, and that it wouldn't cause a further divide in any dimension of humanity. And that's a dimension we would have completely lost if we had just gone to the whiteboard and started listing good and bad.
That's a great point. And I wonder, as you think about the future of the ROM Call, what are the kinds of things that you think will draw other firms, other religious institutions, other governmental entities into that collaboration? As you think about its expansion, what do you think is going to pull people in? And are there any barriers that you think might create bumps in the road?
Yeah, there's been tremendous interest and follow-up. We ran head on into the COVID thing, which slowed us down a bit, but we've had meetings with many of the other great religions of the world that are very interested in this. Many big corporations are studying it carefully because many corporations have been busy writing rules, and they realize that the technology, again, is changing so fast that they can't keep up writing the rules. So let's go back to the basics. And they're looking at this as sort of a foundational document and set of thoughts. So our intent is to follow up with additional signatories, but also it's viewed, as a living document. We're going to learn a lot, and I'm sure we'll be back together as a team, looking at, well, what's transpired in the last couple of years, and what do we need to update in that document, in the ROM Call.
This seems like a great space to acknowledge the enormity of the problem that faces every one of these institutions, and to highlight the power of collaboration as something that can actually help everybody to get a little bit more of a handle on it. Thinking about that, I want to sort of help us transition a little bit more to thinking about your particular career journey. And I know that collaboration has been something really at the center of a lot of what you have done. Could you speak a little bit about the role of collaboration for you as a kind of leadership tool alongside, obviously, all of the elements of leadership that have to do with making sure that your firm is competitive? How do you think about the role of collaboration as part of that?
Sure. Another fantastic question. So, I've always felt, Heather, that, as big as IBM is, and as much as we spend in R&D and all the patents we generate, we don't have a corner on the market of smart people and ideas, much less the means to bring them to market. And so I've always used collaboration, even with competitors, as a way of advancing our technology and our business. We did it, at big scale in semiconductors with other companies, with the Samsungs and Toshibas of the world, companies that in some cases competed with us. A second dimension to collaboration, though, is around open innovation. And so we've always been, and I've been a huge supporter of open source software, where it's not developed strictly in one of our labs someplace in the world. It's the community. We contribute to the community, and we take the open source software, and then we build products above it and below it. But the nugget of say Linux, as an example, is an open source community, and we nurture that community. We help. We put code into it, but we do get the benefits back in that regard. So another dimension of this collaboration are these open communities, and we see it as a force multiplier for our own R&D, as well as it's just a fantastic way to bring new technology into the company.
Wonderful. I want to zoom out a little bit and take a look at your incredibly long and impressive career. I mean, it's so rare these days to find people who have the benefit of long tenure in an organization, and you have 4 decades at the forefront of innovation at this incredible pioneering firm. I want to ask you to sort of reflect on the balance that you struck during that 4-decade-long sort of tenure, making incredible transformative change on the technological side. We talked about the semiconductors and the supercomputers and AI and all of that, but also driving incredible transformative change on the business side of the house in terms of partnerships in intellectual property and security and privacy. Can you tell our audience a little bit about how you transitioned your STEM background and your technical work into roles that unite technology and business functions?
Sure. So when I joined IBM, I literally, Heather, defended my PhD thesis on a Friday and started at IBM Monday back in 1980. But when I joined, to be honest and transparent, all I wanted to do was technology. It was just put John in an R&D lab and I would be happy. But I quickly learned that, and this is part of why I came to industry versus academia at the time, I quickly learned that to get things done and to have an impact at any kind of scale, I had to pull teams together and I had to understand the business side. And that is what caused me to finally understand what I was best at, but also what was most effective for the company. And I always sort of describe myself as being on the diagonal. And what I mean by that is if you view sort of business this way and technical this way, I'm like on this diagonal. And I've wandered off the diagonal at different points in my career, pure business, pure technology. But by and large, for 4 decades, I stayed close to that diagonal. And I'm just very fortunate that it's what I enjoy most. If I'm doing just technical or just business for any extended period, I'm not very happy. But it turns out that I have found in a company like IBM and many of the other tech firms that you not only am I happier, but you can get a lot more done and have a lot more impact on the world. I mean, think about if we hadn't brought AI to market, we wouldn't have changed the world. We're now bringing quantum computing to market. We could have left it in our labs and advanced qubits and things, but so what? And so we've got to bring it out to the world, and that's where business comes in.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it brings to mind, the sort of stereotype of those who have great technological skill, a great sort of focus in this area, the sort of stereotype of individuals in this area as lone wolves who want to get all of their work done independently, who want to make their career success on the basis of their individual brilliance. And I think that the existence of that stereotype can often overshadow the importance of the ability to work within teams, to pull together teams, to build relationships that help to maximize the value of the individual technical skills that people have. I want to ask you to reflect on those kinds of relationships, maybe in particular mentorship relationships, which is something we talk a lot about here, is something important for our students to cultivate. Can you tell us about the role of mentorship in driving your own career success?
Sure. So, and sort of segueing from the last discussion, I always believed, Heather, that it wasn't about just inventing a technology or leaving a piece of technology out there. That as a leader, one of your most, if not the most important legacy is the team you leave, the team you build, and what that team then goes on to do. And I'm very proud, whether it was the AI team or our semiconductor teams or supercomputing teams, those teams go on and on and on to do bigger and better things. And that, I think, is a contribution that goes way beyond, the thing itself. So on mentorship, I've been extremely fortunate and blessed. I've had mentors, both in IBM and outside, but probably not traditional mentors, not mentors you sit down with and have a chat and they sort of coach you and, well, John, you got to do more of this or more of that, or try that kind of job. I had very little of that. What I did have, though, is a set of mentors and network that would challenge me and give me experiences. So throw me in to something that was much bigger and much more difficult than I thought I could possibly deal with or handle. And it's sort of sink or swim, throw him in the deep end of the pool and see if he comes out. But what you learn from that is incredible. You really learn how to get things done, how to work with people, but you become more confident in yourself. Okay, throw me in a deeper pool and I'll find a way through it. And so the best mentors I've had are the ones that they don't sit down with me, 1 hour a month or whatever. They're always around and they're like, okay, John, go do this. See if you can take that on. And it could be technology, it could be business, it could be a people issue, a leadership issue, a government issue, but just, go try this one. And through those experiences, then you just build up this incredible sort of well-rounded capability.
It's really interesting. I think a lot of our students tend to think of mentorship initially as something that's meant to make your life easier. Like you go find somebody who's done it before, they tell you how to do it, and then you're on easy street. And what you're saying is, in some sense, the opposite. Find people who are going to make your life harder.
Absolutely. For the students, if you enjoy sitting with people who don't challenge you, that's okay. But find people who will, throw you in the deep end of the pool. And the other thing I would say is, don't be afraid to take on really tough things. I'll admit that at first I was afraid to do it. Could I really do it? And then I started to think, well, gee, people will start to associate me with, okay, there's a problem. John's always around. So, which is chicken and which is egg. But I found that the biggest challenges, whether it's in technology or business, attracts the best people and the best minds. And so I always sought to go to where the problems were, because I knew I'd be rubbing shoulders with brilliant people, and maybe some of that would sink in to me. And so run to the problems. And if you can't run there, have a mentor that'll throw you at the problems, and amazing things will happen.
I love that. I am going to see if we can use the last little bit of time just to make sure we get our audience questions in. Give me a second. I'm just going to try to pull up those.
Okay.
So our first question is that Dr. Kelly mentioned that IBM has a solid set of guiding principles. How do we ensure that companies without principles are held to the same standards?
Well, that's an area where precision regulation has to come in, and that's why we realized that and crossed that bridge, because not everybody and every company will have the same set of ethics, and so we do need the precision regulation to protect against the corner cases and the most harmful cases to society. A second thing that can be done, and this is to help people abide by the principles. You can actually build into the technology things that will monitor and compare behavior to your principle. And so as an example, we built a set of software that all of our developers use in IBM, which is constantly monitoring their code to see whether the code is structured in a way to develop a bias or whether the data they use to train it is developing a bias. Think of it as sort of a bias meter. And so as you're writing code, it's going, okay, you're getting much more biased, you better come back. And what we find is that if most people, they're not conscious that they're doing it, but if you show them what they're doing, most people will mid-course correct if they understand what they're doing. So I think the precision regulation, but also giving people the tools, because by far most people are ethical. And if they realize what they're doing, they'll react accordingly.
Yeah, and it highlights the opportunity to put yourself in an environment where you are getting kind of early warning signals about the alignment of your principles and your behaviors, rather than having to only be subject to something like the regulations from external entities.
That's right. Another example would be, one of our principles is we don't leave holes in our code, what are called backdoors in software that somebody or some government or whatever can come in through. And so that's a fundamental principle. And so our people that write our software and our code are very conscious not to be sloppy, to leave a door slightly open, if you will, or a window slightly open. Take the time to make sure that every door is closed and locked and every window so that the code is protected from people who might want to do harm to it.
That's excellent. There's a question about whether or not you see an arms race in artificial intelligence and how that might be influencing the moral foundations of AI.
Well, unfortunately, like most technologies, these are all multiple use technologies. And so there is a bit of an arms race. It's both from an economic standpoint, but also military. I mean, most of the major military powers of the world, including the US, have openly talked about leveraging AI in defense systems and offensive systems. So in that sense, it is a bit of an arms race. And this is where, again, I think we need, like we did with the internet and cybersecurity, and we still need, we really need more international discussion around these topics. What is acceptable use of the technology? I'll give you a very specific example. One of our principles is that we will always, in potentially life-threatening conditions, we will always make sure there's a human in the loop. We will not allow an IBM AI system to take data, use AI, and then cause something to happen without having a human in that loop, either on the intake or the decision process. And we think that's really a fundamental, important principle in an arms race, if you will. So again, I think if we get back to the principles, we have more international discussion, that would be wonderful. And I go back to, the ROM Call. If Microsoft, IBM, and the Catholic Church can come together, then I think anyone can come together on the right principles.
I think it's certainly encouraging. And I want to jump to a question that also sort of helps us to dig into the question of how humans can be in the loop, or how humans and AI can complement each other and drive one another to better outcomes. The question is, I wanted to know if there are any advances in using AI to help humans learn differently so that humans can compete with AI, at least in decision making.
Yes. So I would strike the last part of that question, which is to compete with. And I can't emphasize enough that this is human plus machine. And there have been countless studies in all sorts of domains, Heather, that pit basically in a challenge a human plus a machine against either a machine or a human. And in every case, in every field, human plus machine always win, always can beat one or the other. And that has stood true since the early days of Watson, to the point now where Garry Kasparov, when he plays chess as an example, wants his matches to be, he wants a machine with him. I wouldn't want to play chess against Garry and a machine. That would be an impossible thing to win. But think of it as human plus machine, as opposed to, can we cause one to be able to beat the other? I have to admit that I don't know if it was right for me to use, whether it was Deep Blue or Watson, in demonstrations of human versus machine, because in a sense it drove that kind of thinking, which causes this kind of question. If I had it to do over again, I think I would do a human plus a machine versus a machine and a human, to show that power. And I guess I would just end this particular question with, that puts so much burden on the human-machine interface, and optimizing that. And we now have so much work going into how do humans best interact with machines, and how do machines now read and interact with us. The natural language processing of these machines is actually better than humans.
Yeah.
But how does the machine understand your tone, your position, your face, your reaction, and how does it sort of impedance match as an engineer with the human? And that whole field is just open for great research.
I really love that point, and I'll finish this up there, just because I think that notion of the addition, the human plus machine, the idea that we're talking about some things that come together in common good to make everything better on all sides. I think that's been something that has come up multiple times throughout our conversation. It helps to explain why I think the sort of the principles-based approach and the principles that you were able to come together around when you came together with Microsoft and the Roman Catholic Church, sort of getting down to that root. What brings us all here? What is that sort of common benefit for humanity that we're all striving towards? If we can get there, then I think the specific differences we might have, or the discussions that we need to work through in order to drive AI and technology forward, become much, much more manageable and much more fruitful. So with that, I want to give you just one last chance to say, is there anything you want to add, to share with our community, any upgrades on what I've said?
Well, I think I would end with one thought, which is these machines are just a reflection of who we are as humans. I was once asked, John, does Watson have a soul? Will Watson choose a religion? Et cetera, et cetera. And I reminded the person that this machine was built by humans, it's trained by humans, it's programmed by humans, it's corrected by humans. So whatever set of ethics it develops, or whatever religion, is totally up to us. And we need to be very conscious of what we're doing with these machines, because in a sense, when we look at these AI machines, we're looking in the mirror. We're really looking in the mirror.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John Kelly, for joining us. It's an incredible pleasure to have been able to spend this time with you. Thank you to our audience, and thank you to Terry and the Easton Center for putting this on. Have a great day.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Excellent. Let me just add my own thanks to John and to Heather. What a great way to start. And I want to share a couple of my so whats. I don't want to wait to the very end, because I think these are cumulative in nature and matter a lot. And I'm going to start out when John talked about personalization and what's created problems. People feel like, who you are is being exposed, maybe not in a good way. Well, if you put that aside for a second and think about what technology does, it allows for personalization. You think about recommendation engines, it tries to get a better understanding in areas of media to know what you like to make relevant recommendations. If you look at healthcare, so this dichotomy of personalization, which is a core benefit of AI, is also something that makes people feel not so good. And so you better design it well to get the real benefit. If personalization was a nothing issue, then you would say forget about all of it. But it's one of the big benefits. Second comment that John made that I thought was a very important call to action: if you don't develop the innovation, somebody else is going to do it. So to think that the answer is, let me stop all my development, let me not develop products and services that are technology-based, is not a good answer, because somebody else is probably going to develop it, and society is going to have the same issue, and companies are going to have the same issue. Third thing is, what are the imperatives of leaders here? And I always find this interesting, so we get past what could be a theoretical discussion. John talked about at IBM a variety of things that they use as their tools to make sure the technology is wisely managed. He talked about transparency principles, he talked about precision regulation, and he talked about bias meters, all as examples, and they're heavily oriented around what you as a leader and you as a company own, as opposed to what I call punting stuff. Bring regulation on. And it's like, well, what does somebody exactly mean when you say bring regulation on? So I thought those points were excellent. A couple of last things. This human plus machine is better than human or just machine. I have to admit, when I cover in my class, we talk about the growing capabilities of machines, and they will eclipse humans at some point with lots of data. John's making a very important point. When you're talking about pushback, concern, et cetera, and even it can be on a basic level about adoption of AI, if you're pitting the machine against a human, you're going to get a real sense of pushback on that opportunity. So think about human plus machine as where the real benefits are. Final comment he made, again, a real commentary about individuals in society. The machines are just a reflection of who we are. That can either be a good thing or a bad thing. And I think what he's saying is, be a good person, develop the right intentions, et cetera, and you'll get good products. Don't do that, and you're going to have a big problem on your hands. And I think he's indirectly calling out there have been some companies that have not managed this stuff very well. Shame on them. Let me just thank Heather. I just want to thank you again for eliciting a great, great conversation that is truly interdisciplinary. This is a living example of kind of transcending boundaries as you think about business and leadership. So huge thank you. Well done.